Right. And let's see, who else do we have? Ariel, hello.
Hey there, David. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Glad to see you. And I think we're close to having our lineup here.
Great to see you and everyone else, of course.
Yeah, I think we're waiting only on. Who are we waiting on? We're waiting on John Fitzpatrick LeCounte, who is listed, I think, first in the order here in the program. And so let's see if he is able to connect. Oh, I'll bet that's him right now. Let's see. Hello, John, can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
very good, very good. This, where, let me see here. Where are you on my screen? Does it say, oh, no, there it is. Oh, hello, John, I see you now, John.
Oh.
There we go. Well, goodness, it's 11:45 a.m. Eastern time in the United States. I'm in Los Angeles, so it's 8:45 a.m. for me. And one of the odd things about being hooked to East Coast time for those of us in the Pacific Standard Time zone is that the receptions at the end of today, tomorrow, and Saturday, which start between 5 and 5:45 Eastern, they start between 2 and 2:45 on the West Coast. And we had a little discussion about this yesterday, and as someone observed, the LERA is encouraging mid-afternoon drinking, assuming that, of course, people on the West Coast participate. So I don't say that's a problem, but just something to be worked out. So, well, hello, everyone. This is the LERA AILR, Advances in Industrial and Labor Relations, Best Papers session at the 74th LERA meeting. We have had such a session, I think now for about 20 years, one at each of the last 20 years worth of meetings. And the papers that we'll be hearing about today in the short amount of time we have were selected out of a competitive submission and assessment process. And it is these four that made it through that process to the LERA program. Also, as some of you probably know, maybe many of you know, if you want your paper to be considered for publication in Advances in Industrial and Labor Relations, you simply submit the paper with that request. We try to get these refereed expeditiously, and then we let you know about the decision there. I have here volume 26 of Advances in Industrial and Labor Relations. My co-editor is Paul Gollan, who is, of course, in Australia. And several of the papers in this volume were originally presented at either last year's LERA meeting or in a prior year's LERA meeting, going back 2 years, for example. And volume 27 is in process right now. So we've had a pretty good representation in that journal of papers that have been presented at LERA meetings. And I wanted to just let you know that if you didn't know that already. So why don't we have the presentations in the order that they're listed in the program. We'd start with John, and then Hengxu, and then Ed McDermott, and then Ariel Avgar. And if you, 10 minutes with a standard deviation of a minute or two each, that would still leave us some time to discuss the papers and Q&A and chat and that sort of thing. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
All righty, well then we're gonna turn to you, John, and lead off with your paper. The title of which is Human Resource Management Solutions, Implications for Small Business Owners Managing Labor Unionization and Employee Relations.
I've been playing with the title because, as you know, when you're conducting research, you find more information.
Right. So I just gave the group an outdated title. Here's the current title.
Yeah. I have a framework for helping small business owners managing industrial relations while mitigating labor unionization. So this is the purpose of the study. I wanted to understand why small business owners often overlook the human resources aspect of small business ownership. When I was a doctoral student, I created a survey about CEO succession planning. And I focused mainly on small businesses because they're the lifeblood of the country. And most of the most successful companies either started as a small business or family business. And many of the owners of these companies would tell me after completing the survey that they never thought about the people issues or the human resource aspects of owning their business. They often look at human resources as an additional cost. And that they're mostly fascinated with revenue growth, which is, of course, is important, but without the right people in place, that's not going to happen. Next, I provide an integrated human resource management solutions for small businesses. I also will describe a framework that I have, and the framework would be for mitigating issues that may cause employees to consider unionization within organizations. Questions at this point? No? Here, I discuss the common concerns for small business owners. Let me, hold on. All right. The common concerns, they want to have a sustainable competitive advantage over all of the other companies that are in their space. Many small business owners lack financial resources. Many of whom that I've interviewed in the past, they saved up money, they took out loans, or they went into a business with partners looking to build a business. So at some point between 3 and 5 years, they could have a point where they're profitable or they can consider selling the business. The other issue is they're unable to attract and retain a competent workforce. And a lot of that is because they lack a lot of training about how to attract and retain quality employees. Small business owners lack an understanding of how financial resources impact their business oftentimes, and how that's intertwined with the workforce that's selected to help them deliver their products and services. Small business owners think that they cannot afford competent HRM and labor management employees to help them with some of these issues. They're mainly focused on hiring people to carry out day-to-day functions on a tactical level versus strategic level. Questions at this point? No? Okay. Some of the byproducts of their concern is the lack of financial resources, which leads to a transactional decision-making process when dealing with employees and customers. Employees are considered expendable, similar to numbers on a spreadsheet oftentimes. Employees feel disparaged and develop low morale. Low morale will lead to employees doing the bare minimum described in their job description. They will not go above and beyond whatever the supervisor asks of. Low morale also leads to the subversion of company policies. In past literature, that's been described as workarounds. They see what the policy says, but instead of discussing some of the issues with the policy and implications on business operations and talking to a supervisor, since there's a lack of trust there, they will simply either ignore or follow an ineffective order to manage operations on a day-to-day basis. Low employee morale limits organizational performance as well. Especially with COVID-19, many small business owners were forced to close, and they also filed bankruptcy, many of whom will never come back. And some of this could have been avoided if they had more employee loyalty. I look at social exchange theory as a theoretical framework. It describes interaction, social behavior between two parties. In this instance, I'm looking at small business owners and employees. How are they interacting, and how can we look at transforming an adversarial situation to mitigate labor unionization? Questions at this point? No? Okay. Here's a conceptual model that I've created. As you can see, it's at the top, we talk about the small business. We look at strategy and sustainability. We go down, HRM solutions, look at analysis and development, labor relations, we look at compensation and fair processes. Small business strategy, it should include employee empowerment as a part of their strategy. Many organizations, especially small businesses, operate on what we call a flat organization, meaning that there's more interaction between employees and stakeholders or owners or senior management. Also, with that strategy, when you get more buy-in and loyalty from the employees, the companies are able to navigate through hard times, such as a pandemic, with sustainability. This HRM solutions, we look at analysis of the company. How are the small business owners interacting with the employees? Do the employees feel valued? Do they feel as though they're part of the team? And do they feel as though they actually have a future or career with that company? In the development piece, I'm focused mainly on the small business owners because they're the owners and they drive the train. They create the policies and the procedures. So in my view, the onus is on them to create a welcoming environment that will inspire employees to go above and beyond what's on the job description, or maybe tactical decision-making imposed by managers within the company. So within that development piece, it's important that there's open dialogue between all of the parties so that we can have a robust increment increase of organizational performance. Last piece, labor relations. We need to make sure that the compensation is fair, preferably a little bit more than their competitors. so that they can get quality employees, possibly at a technical expert level to help them thrive versus going through a staffing agency to employ people to try them out for a certain part of time, certain, 30 to 60 days. If we encourage small business owners to look at competitive compensation, they won't have such high turnover. The last piece of this, we want to look at fair processes. Are the processes within the company fair to both parties, or are the processes one-sided?
Speaking of being fair, you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay. Questions, you can contact me right here. And I want to open up the floor for any questions.
John, could you specify or define a small business? What is the dividing line between a small and a not small business?
Yes, sir. So the Department of Commerce says that 499 employees or less are considered a small and medium-sized enterprise legally.
So it's measured by employment, not revenue or assets or something like that.
Yes. So it could be 1 to 5 employees, long as it's under 499 employees.
And does that same data set, or perhaps another, indicate the turnover? I don't mean sales turnover. I mean, how long a small business typically is in existence?
That's a great question. Many small businesses fail. I would say 3 out of 5 that are created. Typically in the business cycle, you're not profitable until around year 5. Many major companies such as JP Morgan, they put that into their calculation when they invest in the companies and when they move to a new location. And that's why it's so difficult for small business owners to operate, because they don't have the financial resources and the sustainability to weather those storms if there's something like COVID that comes up, like a pandemic.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions for John at the moment? If not, and speaking of COVID, we're going to turn next to.
Somebody raised their hand.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, yes.
Sorry, hi, how should I call you? Dr. John? Sorry.
Oh, you just call me John.
Okay, John, hi, I'm a PhD student at U of I. And I thought that your paper is more like empirical thing, but so are you planning to distribute survey in the future?
Yes.
Or is it more like theoretical models?
So initially, this is a theoretical piece, and I'm hoping to get it published in David's journal. And once it's published, then I'll create an instrument based on the publication, and then I'll look at the local chamber of commerce, and I'll like in the next week and a half, I'll attend a chamber of commerce meeting that focuses on small businesses and small business CEOs, and I'll look at events like that and distribute the survey and collect data.
Oh, okay. So I do agree with you, because I think there's not much research that's specifically focused on small and medium-sized enterprises or small businesses. My question is, so like your model is about like HRM, and then it will affect the labor relations. Sorry. And like, I think that theoretical models also can apply to like, like large companies as well. So
Yes.
how do you distinguish your results from like that, like results in like mainstream or large companies?
And we'll, after you answer this question, we'll move on to the next paper.
Okay. I will only survey small business owners. in small businesses. I won't survey Fortune 500 companies or companies that have more than 499 employees.
Oh, okay.
So you do plan to do empirical testing of the model, which I think is the basis of your questions, Yasul. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Xinguo Yu is going to present the paper on behalf of himself and his colleagues. And since John mentioned COVID, the title of this paper is Quantifying Resilience of Labor Market to the COVID-19 Pandemic, Evidence from Large-Scale Online Recruitment Behavior. And there is the title. And
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to present this paper. I'm Xinguo Yu from Peking University, and this paper is co-authored with my classmate Hengxu Song from Peking University and Ting Ren, a professor from Peking University, with my advisor, and Dr. Yanbo from Korean Science Lab. And here's the content. This is empirical paper, and here's the motivation of our research. The many countries have been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, while governments in every countries have implemented different policies for prevention, such as lockdown policies in regions to cope with this crisis. So the figure shows the basic pattern of pandemic in China, which is the first wave of the pandemic. The CDC data have shown the most severe period for China is from January to February in 2020. And we also can see some Chinese economy is affected by this huge pandemic shock, especially some macro level index, such as industrial value added growth and aggregated consumption in some and investment rates. We can see there is a big jump in the first quarter of 2020 in China. So why we cannot ignore some important factors, such as the Chinese labor market in the pandemic. Here is the first reason can be observed from the factors in production function. As we know, labor is an essential factor for the economy, and the pandemic shock directly affects the labor market. So due to the virus and the lockdown policies, people are forced to stop work or change job from on-site to online. So due to the huge uncertain shock, firms choose wait and see strategy to adjust and decline the worker demand. So when the pandemic induced impact is basically controlled, the labor demand will rebound. So, but adjustment in the employment market cannot recover as soon as the stop market. So then we try to explore some factors in recovery and the resilience of Chinese employment market. So another reason in this study is about the industrial employment structure. So we can explore more heterogeneous dimensions, such as industry, regions, and skill requirements through the lens of Chinese labor market. So the third reason is few researchers focus on the performance of Chinese labor market during the pandemic, especially for the lack of timeless and informative individual and macro level data. So based on the above motivations, our study quantifies the impact of COVID-19 on Chinese labor market using a post-event analysis and online recruitment platform data. And we measured labor market resilience to the sudden unexpected shock from different dimensions and the heterogeneity based on the industrial employment structure. So according to the literature, we obtained some insights from other COVID-19 papers, and the paper also contribute to the literature referred to the study of resilience in the field of urban labor economics. We construct some specific measurements by the unique online labor market data. Also, we provide some mechanism following to emergent potential explanation as labor market concentration and local economic complexity for the industrial employment structure. So here is our contribution. We use the new data to describe the facts about the performance of the labor market, and we use the new measurements, and the resilience can be decomposed into resistance and recoverability. And we find the pandemic can lead heterogeneous resilience response in regional and industrial level. And we give some new explanation which can be used to explain the resilience. Yeah, here's all the data. We use the online recruitment data, which is employer to employee matched the job posting panel data from 2017 to 2020 from China's largest online labor market platform. And the data is not plural data from the website because the plural data cannot tell us about the matched job posting information. So we obtained the equivalent results considering both the supply side and the demand side. So it's a unique but anonymous data. The specific data sources is from Korea Science Lab. And we also introduced some new concept of the resilience to understand the heterogeneous elasticity of the local job market. By the intuition, resilience can be decomposed as the resistance and the recoverability. By intuition, when a elective shock happens, resistance is the ability to prevent from recession relative to the average level at the contraction time, while the recoverability is to rebound to the normal level relative to the average level at the expansion time. So the figure can explain our intuition. After shock, the resistance makes sense in the contraction time, and the recoverability makes sense in the expansion for the economy. Also, we have the algorithm of resistance and the recoverability. You can see the numerator is the individual response, and the denominator is the absolute value of the average response to the pandemic shock. This figure shows how to compute the resistance and recoverability, and the resilience is ideally equal to the resistance plus recoverability. So besides, we also construct two emerging index to give potential mechanism analysis, which is the labor market diversification, which is the inverse of the labor market concentration, which is follow the emerging paper from the Ariel 2020. And we also conduct another new index for the ECI, Economic Complexity Index. So here, here is our empirical results. And you can see the reaction of Chinese labor market to the COVID-19. So the figure shows in aggregated level, the matched job posting, the black solid line have huge deviation from the faded line since the 2019 December to the February 2020. So it is a significant shock. Even we also consider and control the seasonal factors. And for the wage and labor supply decrease is larger than the labor demand decrease. So the wage increases during the pandemic. So in the city level, Chinese local job market resilience is imbalanced. So we rank the cities by the local GDP, such as Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. They are the top 4 cities. The X axis for the figure is the recoverability, and the Y axis is the resistance. We can find the resistance and the recoverability are actively correlated at first, which is consistent to our intuition and hypothesis. And the second, we can find some small cities have higher resistance and recoverability than the large cities. And third, the Chinese labor market resilience is highly correlated to the city scale and the pandemic risk exposure.
You've got about 2 minutes.
Okay. Here is industry level. We find different industry have the heterogeneous reaction. The hotel and the catering had the lowest resistance, and the manufacturing have, like mining, have the highest resistance for the COVID-19. And we conclude some basic empirical evidence. The pandemic indeed caused large contractions, nearly 50% from 2019 to 2020. And here we briefly show our maximum analysis. We use the two emerging index, ECI index, which is a region could play an important role in the city level. And here we show our results as a difference in difference analysis. And we find the Chinese labor market demand structural change after pandemic. And here we also conduct another index, the industrial level heterogeneity. And we use the post-event analysis as our identification strategy. And we can find a higher labor market diversification will increase the resistance in the pandemic after the we run the DID model. And here is our conclusion. Yeah, here is our conclusion. We quantify the resistance of the labor market to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see in the aggregate level, the pandemic caused a significant negative shock to the Chinese labor market. And in city level and the industrial level, we find the different reactions to the pandemics. And we further explained the resilience based on the two emergent mechanisms as the ECI and the labor market diversification. So thank you. Here are some ways, and we will do our job in the future and extend our research project. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can your data, the pandemic official sort of start month is March 2020.
Yeah.
How far past March 2020 does your data set cover? Does it go into 2021 at all?
Yeah. We this is the first draft, and we extend our research to 2021. Yeah, in the 2021, and we also continue to extend our data in 2022. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Anybody else? Anybody have a question for Xinguo? If not, we will move on to the paper by Patrick McDermott, and his co-author is Ruth Obar. I think this paper has the perhaps most interesting title, Online Mediation Participant Experience at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Do the data herald the creative destruction of in-person dispute resolution? So Pat and Ruth have borrowed a phrase from Schumpeter, if I recall correctly. And Pat, I think the floor is yours. Do you go by Pat? Pat? You're on mute. You're on mute. There you go. No, you're still on mute.
Here we go. Thank you,
There we go.
David. I was well behaved on mute, but now it's time to talk. First, I want to thank you for all the years on this project. And I think we were together in New Orleans, and it was like about 2000. So I may have been one of the first back then. And we were looking at the in-person EEOC dispute resolution model, and it was much heralded at the time. And it was very arguably controversial at the time. And that presentation, I think it was entitled, "Has the EEOC Hit a Home Run?" with Steve Ignowski. And we'll be back at 3:15 for a workshop on discussing these results in greater detail. So I want to leave plenty of time for Avi, so I'm going to try to move fast here. Yesterday, a press release came out from the EEOC heralding this data. So it's hot off the press. There's two reports. The one I'm discussing, the paper, is actually a 140-page report loaded with data. It's the largest database on workplace dispute resolution where we actually hear from the people about the process. The prior one in 2000 was one of the largest databases. There's a lot of literature review that says there should be more work done like this, but it hasn't been done. So if I showed the research that has been done, I'd be citing my database for the most part. So I don't want to do that. I want to move into the results here. Why is this the most effective voice? Because we're talking about employee voice. Within the EEOC, we have to understand that when somebody suffers workplace discrimination, perceives they do, that they file a charge, and then eventually they're going to get a right to sue letter. The right to sue letter is going to say, you don't have a case, you do have a case, we haven't figured out whether you have a case, but you got 90 days to get a lawyer. The lawyer is going to say how much money you have to give me. I'm going to take a contingency so that there's no legal fees. But of course, the expenses of the retainer just for the costs, it's going to be more than the average worker can afford. So the average worker, and it's been reported, we have data on this, they don't pursue the case at that point. So up to the point through the EEOC, they literally have no voice, right? And the few that decide to get a lawyer, there's a great, he's passed, a legal empiricist at Cornell, Eisenberg, and others, Claremont and Schwab and all have discussed the fact that the chances of winning an employment litigation in federal court is slim to none. It's one of the worst causes of action you can maintain. So the background in developing this study is that one of the authors has 30 plus years of employment litigation mediation experience before FINRA, administrative agencies, litigated these cases in federal district court, argued 3 federal court of appeals cases. So we have a practitioner perspective, which is particularly important in the development of the methodology and the measurements. I think that's just a strategic advantage because you know what to ask. And so one more thing to say, Cornell AILR had a program in the midst of the COVID, and Marty Scheinman, who founded the Scheinman Conflict Resolution Center up there, Marty indicated it's up to the social scientists to report on the impact of online collective bargaining, online dispute resolution, et cetera. And I thought that was really cool because I took that, I was already working on this with the EEOC, but this was really a charge to say, yes, it is time for the social scientists to speak up. Because in that seminar and others, people were talking about Zoom fatigue. They were talking about, could you read body language? Persons that said, oh, if you're not in person, it's not happening. You had all this anecdotal information. And at the same time, I'm doing this as an attorney before I close my law practice. And I'm noticing that this is actually pretty effective. Also, as I'm doing this study. So it really was a great charge by Marty. So here's the data. We have 1,234 actual completed surveys. There were online surveys completed by the parties. And we measured over 10 months, we developed a survey, pre-tested it with the supervisors for EEOC. We did a mediator survey to ask mediators their perceptions, and I'm discussing the participant survey. Therefore, we've got triangulation of data. When people say, well, you didn't quite ask this question the way I'd like, I would say, yeah, but the mediator reported this, and the data triangulates. These are pretty robust results. And we go back to having benchmark questions from our first work back in 2000, which were consistently asked every year by the EEOC for like a month, just to continue to see if they were meeting the same standards. So we were able to use our benchmark questions from 2000 in person and compare to the online dispute resolution. And then we added our ODR focus questions, which is probably the most interesting area. Charging parties, counsel for both parties and employers filled out these surveys. And we had 6 key measures we reported. One was the fair procedures by the mediator, procedural justice. 86% of the charging parties, 94% of the employers said the procedures were fair. This is one of our benchmark measures that compares similarly to the past study. Overall fairness, 82% of the charging parties, 91% of the employers. Again, we measure across the 2000 and the data is usually as good, close, sometimes better. Would they use ODR again? 92% said yes. That's resounding success. Then we asked what I thought was a great question to really kind of ferret out the impact of ODR. Would you prefer to do this online or in person? We used closed-end questions at gate because we wanted to know more about why they would prefer, but we also had open-ended responses. 66% of the respondents said they'd prefer to stay online. 13% said they want to go back in person. Now think of all the discussion in this country about the future of work, going back to work. And this is problem solving. This is pretty complex problem solving, mediation. And we see this great success for a lot of reasons. And we asked employers, are you more likely to engage in dispute resolution if it's online? And they said, yes, 62%. And that's an impact factor. So these results are quite startling. And we have a massive database where we ask so many other questions. That's why it's 140 pages. We look at mediator performance and technical skills, the relief the parties expected. And here we kind of look at the concept in mediation of transformative mediation, which was an entire theory. Basically, we find this is a transactional process. So EEOC mediation is not transformational. Most parties have lost their job, and it's transactional. Part of the transaction is seeking restoration of dignity, but there's no transformation in the relationship of the parties. It's much more transactional. What did the employer want? The employer wanted to save time, et cetera. Only 2% wanted what I call absolution, because the questions offered them the opportunity to closed-end survey to say, we made a mistake, we did something wrong, and we wanted to remedy it. Well, that's 2%. 98% of the employers didn't think they made a mistake. Impasse, right? We looked at the impasse, the negotiation impasse, and even some new questions. And basically, if somebody asked for, or the spread, excuse me, the spread at impasse was over 40,000, 78% of these cases, I'm sorry, this is a demand. If the demand was over 40,000, 78% of these cases hit impasse. The impasse spread, right? This is a different measure. If the parties were within less than $10,000, only 14% of those cases weren't resolved. And if they were less than $3,000, less than 5% of them weren't resolved. So what that means is if the money was close, the mediators were bringing the case in, they were settling the case. We didn't have short amounts of money where there's an impasse spread. That's a whole other line of analysis, really, that was just a bonus.
About 2 minutes, Pat.
Okay, go to finish. Okay, fine. That's really the key information, and I'm interested in any questions anybody has.
Do some of these matters involve universities, colleges and universities?
It's everything. It's across the board. I, for one, litigated a denial of tenure case against a university, remain unnamed, but that went through, obviously, the EEOC first. and also, yes, they do.
Yeah. One can imagine student administrator, faculty student disputes being in the realm of the data set and subject to potentially online mediation.
Right, but we don't, that's not part of my data, because that would be Title IX as opposed to Title VII.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I believe my point is, I think this is generalizable in fact, we asked that question in the mediators survey. For the mediators, we said, do you mediate in other forums? FINRA, American Arbitration Association, et cetera. Is what you're reporting here, do you find that to be true in these other forums? And they said, yes. Avi has a question.
Ariel has a question. Ariel?
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation, Patrick, and thanks for this really interesting data. And I'm happy to follow up if we don't have time for a full discussion about this. But do you link kind of individual difference level variables to perceptions of ODR? I mean, are there certain groups that are more satisfied or more willing to use ODR in the future versus others? And then what I also find fascinating is the potential to link dynamics during mediation that you capture to outcomes, whether there's impasse or so forth. This is just terrific and rich data. Really excited to hear the results.
Well, one thing, I'm happy to share the data, that's something in the past with our prior database. Seth Harris was doing some work on disability research, and we shared the database and worked with him on that. I think it's important for scholars to take whatever angle. What we did look at, and it's a great question, is we didn't do demographics per se because we knew we could pull that back later if we had to with additional linkage. But we did look at bases of the charges, so disability, race, genetic, et cetera, and found no disparity between the type of the discrimination on alleged age discrimination, disability, et cetera. So across the board, and really what that your comment opens up to, which is great, is some persons commented for being disabled that it was more inviting because of the nature of their disability. So what we really found was the access to justice with more employers willing to participate with some of the nature of the disabilities. And also, and this is what shocked us, and as a scholar, you're always embarrassed because we didn't look at this in 2000. But what was interesting was that there was a lot of safe space issue where people said they didn't want to be in the same building with the other party, much less the same room. And I was shocked at the level of that being reported by both mediators and the parties. Thank you.
Well, of course, faculty would never complain about that, would they? Let's now turn to the fourth and final paper in our LERA AILR best paper session. And this is by Ariel Avgar, who is widely published, as I think you would all know. This paper is titled Conceptualizing Conflict, Ideas and Beliefs about Workplace Conflict and Their Implications for Union and Non-Union Dispute Resolution Models. We like conceptual papers, by the way, at AILR. So it's good to see this. Ariel?
Great. Thank you so much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to you, David. Thanks to you and Paul for organizing this session and for the longstanding link that you mentioned between AILR and LERA. So my presentation is a nice fit following Patrick's presentation. My presentation draws on a conceptual paper, as David noted, that looks at the link between worker, union, and managerial ideas and beliefs about conflict and the conflict resolution models that organizations adopt. I've decided to be a bit bold. I'm going to only use one substantive slide later on in the presentation and just talk to the group in this format for now. So we all know, and Patrick's presentation is a good segue for this, that conflict and its resolution are central and inherent features in the employment relationship, both in the union and in the non-union setting. And industrial relations scholars, many in this Zoom today, have paid really careful attention to the dramatic transformation in organizational conflict management over the last 4 or more decades. And in particular, there's been an effort to document and explain the growing prevalence of new systems, new practices designed to manage organizational conflict. The growth of the rise of ADR, alternative dispute resolution, including the use of mediation, arbitration, and the ombuds office in organizations. And in the union setting, a shift towards, some would argue, a growing proportion of unions and employers experimenting with alternatives to conflictual relationships in the form of labor management partnerships. And so what we know in the conflict resolution arena, as we've painted a really detailed portrait of external and internal pressures that are driving organizations to introduce new dispute resolution models. What we don't know, even though this literature has contributed greatly to what we know, it has not, for the most part, there's some exceptions, but it has not, for the most part, taken into account the role that managerial, union, and worker perceptions about conflict play in explaining the adoptions of fundamentally different conflict resolution regimes. And I'm focused primarily on the United States. So in an effort to incorporate workplace actors' ideas about conflict, in this paper, I developed a typology of different organizational conflict management models based on differences in prevalent beliefs about conflict. It's important to note that this kind of ideational approach or ideational typology builds on the notion that core workplace institutions, structures, and practices, including conflict resolution, are at the very least affected by different underlying perceptions, or as John Budd and others have referred to it, frames of reference regarding the very nature of the employment relationship. And in the paper, I sort of expand on and review John and others' work on frames of reference and use it as a foundation for this argument I make about the centrality of ideas and beliefs about conflict. Outside of our realm, outside of the employment relations field, organizational behavior scholars, for their part, have documented the importance of beliefs and cognitive frames in explaining individual differences associated with conflicts. Individuals, organizational behavior scholars tell us, have been shown to vary in terms of the ways in which they conceptualize conflict, and these differences affect behaviors, interactions, and outcomes. And so despite the fact that we have this evidence from within our field, employment relations, and from the organizational behavior domain, the workplace conflict resolution literature in both the union and non-union context has, again, for the most part, John Budd and Alex Colvin and Dion Kohler have a paper that's an exception, but has for the most part ignored this variation at the ideational level, the ideas and perceptions that individuals in the workplace have about conflict. Conflict beliefs have to date, I argue in the paper, not been used to explain this broader phenomenon, namely the transformation of conflict management or conflict resolution practices in the United States. And in the paper, I try to address the question, to what extent do these ideational differences matter? So I'm gonna share my screen and show my single slide. And I'm going to basically, in the remaining few minutes that I have, build towards this type 4 model typology. And I'm going to argue that the predominant models of dispute resolution that we see in organizations today are the product, among other things, of two dimensions in terms of individual conflict beliefs in organizations. So first, I argue that one of the key distinctions in conceptualizing conflict is the extent to which individuals view conflict as functional or dysfunctional. And you'll see that on the vertical axis of this 2x2 on the screen. On the one hand, there's quite a bit of scholarship and support for a view that sees conflict as a fundamentally destructive phenomenon, undermining relational dynamics, social cohesion, rational exchange in the workplace. And it's these dysfunctional notions of conflict that help to explain the kind of defensive and reactive responses that organizations and unions tend to take in dealing with conflict. On the other hand, an alternative conceptualization of conflict depicts it as a functional organizational phenomenon with a great deal of potential to enhance a variety of outcomes. Conflict, according to this approach, is portrayed as a vehicle through which to voice and address fundamental organizational shortcomings, to improve understanding between labor and management. And it's also an engine, and I think this was on one of Patrick's slides, for healthy and productive debate within organizations, which sparks innovation and prevents groupthink. Okay, so that's one dimension. And the argument is that individuals, managers, union leaders, and workers vary in terms of their ideation around this notion of functionality of conflict. And the second central ideational dimension is the extent to which conflict is viewed as fundamentally a collective or individual phenomenon. And here too, I argue that managers, union leaders, workers vary in the way in which they perceive this dimension. So one approach, there are those who maintain that conflict is at its core a manifestation of individual interpersonal dynamics and relationships in the workplace, and as such should be primarily managed by addressing the specific individual issues raised through conflict. An alternative ideational approach, one that's consistent with our industrial relations perspective on conflict views it as an inextricably linked to conflict, to collective dynamics, needs, interests, and grievances. And this framing of conflict has clear implications for how it should be dealt with and for the acceptance of approaches that rely on collective representation. And what happens, what I do in the paper is I combine these two different dimensions, functionality of conflict and the extent to which it is collective or individual. And I propose 4 different ideal types. And to be clear, these are ideal types that we already see out in the real world. I'm not proposing new ideal types. I'm trying to explain the reality that we've seen in the world around variation in conflict resolution using this new lens, an ideational lens, thinking about the differences in the ideas and beliefs that individuals hold around conflict. I will just, in my remaining minute or two, I will just work through each of these very briefly and say a combination of an individual approach or ideation of conflict and one that is dysfunctional in nature leads to what I refer to as a defensive conflict resolution model, consistent and aligned with the use, for example, of mandatory arbitration, as has been referred in the press, forced arbitration. A dysfunctional belief system or a dysfunctional view of conflict and one that views it as collective helps to explain an adversarial kind of collective approach to conflict resolution, one that might help to explain an approach that an organization like Amazon takes to unionization efforts in its organization. And when we think of conflict as functional, ideational approaches that view conflict as functional, at the individual level, if we think of conflict as functional and primarily an individual phenomenon, that leads to an explanation of organizational use of proactive conflict management systems type approaches to conflict. This helps us understand the rise in conflict management systems in many corporations. And finally, the combination of a functional and collective approach to conflict beliefs or ideas about conflict help to explain a collaborative model for conflict resolution, one that relies on labor management partnership. There are a host of limitations in this paper that I won't share at this point because time is short. I think this framework, this approach helps us to explain variation in conflict management models in existing organization. And in the paper, I draw out those links in more detail. But I'll leave us a few minutes for discussion and I'll conclude there.
Thank you so much, Ariel. Questions for Ariel at all? Oh, by the way, you mentioned reference the theory at the start. It reminded me that Seymour Martin Lipset, the famous sociologist and political scientist, wrote some pretty relevant stuff on reference group theory and especially the choice of reference groups. So, which I'm sure you're well aware of. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, David.
By the way, if you check the chat, and this is germane to Patrick's paper and the discussion at the end that we had, and Patrick was pointing out how people prefer not to be in even the same building. Bill Canick, who is in Tennessee, said at public universities in states like Tennessee, where students and others are allowed to carry concealed weapons since 2016, the desire for safe space may be understandable, an abundance of caution. I hadn't made that connection, but that's Canick for you. So there we go. Any comments for Ariel? Questions?
David, Ashley appears to have a question.
There you go. Sorry,
yeah,
Ashley.
No problem. Quick question. I was just wondering, in the data, was there a consideration for organization type or location and regional differences? The reason I ask is because depending on where you are in the country, I think, or what type of organization that you exist in, you know, those particular, like whether it's private sector versus public sector versus other, depending on those kinds of nuances that could impact that axis that you share, which I think is a great framework.
Ashley, thanks so much for that question. So this paper is a conceptual paper. I don't use data in this paper, but the question of organizational variation for the host of factors that you list and the whole host of other factors is really important. One of the questions we might ask is, where do these beliefs come from to begin with? Why do individuals, managers, union leaders, workers, why do they hold different views about the functionality or dysfunctionality of conflict? Why do they hold different views about collective and individual views of conflict? That is likely shaped by exactly the factors that you're talking about. And a follow-up to this would be to understand the antecedents to different beliefs, as well as the consequences associated with those beliefs in terms of different conflict models. Thanks so much for that question.
And Ashley, you have what looks like a little flower pot on a top of a shelf behind you. And when you asked your question, the raised hand feature of Zoom was right over that pot. And I thought the raised hand was actually something on the top of your bookshelf there. So
Yes,
learning to
this is
live with
just a-
Zoom.
This is just a fancy background, but it's plants that I don't have to water. So thank you.
The best kind.
And we have less than a minute left. Pat, you have a question? Patrick?
Yes, Avi, that was really great. Two things, I don't know if this helps at all. I did a study when I was in China for a year where we looked at the China Labor Arbitration Committee, and in Confucian culture and Chinese culture, the idea of harmony is really important. But what I was surprised was at the Labor Arbitration Committee level, when you screw a guy out of his wages, it's the same reaction as in the US. All this concept of harmony disappears when the individual rights are implicated. And that fascinated me. And I don't know if you can work or if that helps with the theory versus application. And the other thing is, we found with the mediation data that 42% of the employers said that one of the reasons they wanted to participate in the mediation was to show respect for the employee in this dispute process, because they felt as though somehow there'd been a breakdown in respect.
Thanks, Patrick.
Well,
I know we're out of time. That's a super helpful kind of lens to think about the difference between theory and practice around ideations. Thank you for that.
And thanks to all four of our presenters today, and for having submitted for the best paper session in the first place. Again, if you want your paper reviewed for potential publication in Advances in Industrial and Labor Relations, let Paul Gollan and me know. And one little piece of promotion for the next set of sessions, one of them that begins at 1 Eastern, is on labor and workplace journalists. It's the first time such a session has been held at a LERA meeting, and we have 4 very excellent members of a panel, each of whom has in recent past years won a LERA Media Award. And as Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld pointed out in a message he sent to us recently, the industry and section councils are considering creating new ones. One would be labor and workplace journalism. So this is a kind of an interesting development, just to call it to your attention. Thanks so much again, and we'll close the session and see you at others during the remainder of the meeting.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
再见.
All right.
Bye-bye.
You sticking around for the journalists?
Oh,
David?
can one just stay on for that?
I think so. I
Let's
may
see.
err. But-
No, you may be right, because that's
This is the same, the same stream.
You're correct, stream 4. Well, in that case, I'm going to stay on.
Well, good. So this was a great panel. I really appreciated this. So
You mean which session are you
the
talking
one that
about?
just finished.
Just finished. Yes, I think it worked
Yeah.
out very well. Well, it's a little self-promoting to say it, but I think it did work out quite well.
Well, I waited until Ariel left so that he wouldn't get a big head.
Oh, boy.
You already have a large ego, of course.
Hey, Trevor Bain, are you still on, Trevor Bain?
Trevor is just joining with his interest in the journalists. He told me
Oh.
that.
Ah, okay. Right, there we go.
And I see
Chuck,
Cam
Chuck.
Bennett, who represents the IBEW, is here
I think
too.
that's right. Chuck, where are you? Chuck
Chuck
Miller, are
Miller?
you? I think that's Chuck.
Yeah, but he's muted.
So
So
you're muted. Yeah, you're muted.
So thank you for drawing attention to my snarky comment about my current state of Tennessee. And
Well, but I mean, it does, it's an example of why people might prefer not to be on site.
well, we also had employers who prohibited employees from bringing a weapon to the plant, including not allowing them to have a weapon in the trunk of their car if they planned on going hunting after in the evening. And that is that the state of Tennessee looked with a jaundiced eye on employers doing that.
Well, that's an interesting observation you make, because last July, late July of 2021, I took my first plane trip in about a year and a half. I had to go to Houston to testify at an arbitration hearing. And I stayed at a hotel. I think it was a Hyatt.
Yeah.
It had sliding glass doors in the front. And it had two signs next to each other. One said, Texas allows one to carry a concealed weapon.
Yes.
However, this hotel does not. If you have a concealed weapon, either don't bring it into the hotel or you'll have to check it with us. We don't allow it. And the sign next to it said, Texas law allows open carry,
Yes.
visible. Right.
Yes.
We don't allow that in our hotel. Either don't carry it or you have to check it with us. So that told me that at least one employer, one company can set its own policy and go against the law of Texas.
Well, they may see the state of Texas in Attorney General in court.
Yeah, they might. They might. I need a few minutes. I'll be back here. I asked, there's Bernadette. We're just staying on the session 4 stream, right?
You
Bernadette?
can, you absolutely can. I'm going to stop the recording though.